anyone out here tell me what this is? What's going on here?
Star trails.
Well, we've got some star trails going on, but like, I guess, what is this thing?
Lighthouse?
Lighthouse? Yeah. That's the sort of what I was. It is actually a water tower. Okay, but I wanted to turn it into a lighthouse, and I saw that I could easily do that at night. It was a full moon. This was shot in Pittsburgh's North Park, and this is glass right here. There's no light up there. That's actually the light from the moon. The full moon kind of reflecting through there. And knowing what I know and knowing what I'm going to teach you now, I knew kind of where to set up my camera and how to crop it and which direction to point it. So I would get, instead, star trails can come in all sort of shapes and curves and sizes, and I wanted to just get little straight bolts of light to kind of emulate that feeling of that light, that beam of light coming out of a lighthouse. So I knew which way to kind of point it and kind of get those straighter shots of the star trails. So again, a little bit about me. Like I said, I'm self-taught. I actually studied theater in college. That's probably why I'm quite comfortable standing up here in front of you guys. But upon graduating from college, my parents gave me a camera. I was sort of playing around with a lot of videos, making some just fun, silly videos in college. I enjoyed directing more than acting. And so when my parents gave me this advanced point-and-shoot film camera, and I was moving from the East Coast to the West Coast, I took 7 weeks with a 7-week trip with this camera. And that's when I really kind of fell in love with directing the single image. And when I got to the Grand Canyon, I had a couple friends of mine who were working there. And and I'd run out of film. I had, I think, 60 or 80 rolls of film by that time. And I ran out of film, so I went to the gift shop, and they had some film, but all they had was black and white film. And I was like, really? Black and white film? It's like those old movies that, are silent, But I picked up a few rolls of film, shot, and I really actually didn't take any pictures of the Grand Canyon. I was really busy hanging out with my friends. And when I got to San Francisco and started developing all these rolls of film, it was the black and white that struck me the most. And again, even though these were simple images of my friends and I just hanging out, it was just a different way of seeing. Stripped of color, we kind of looked at the essence of the picture. So with that being said, I kind of committed myself. Within about 6 months, I had bought a dark room. I moved to an area in San Francisco called the Lower Haight, and I, like most San Franciscans have done for over the years, I rented a 2-bedroom apartment with 4 people and turned the only closet we had into a dark room. And as David said, there was a community dark room that's still there today, actually. It's called the San Francisco Photo Center, and it has it used to have 200 enlargers there, now it has about 100 enlargers there, and for about $200, $250 a year, you had a membership to go there and use. Now they have digital lab as well as a black and white lab, and it was that community experience of going there, and everyone, we'd work on our little private little enlarger areas, but at the end, everything was washed together, and it came out on this one, on this huge table, and I would see prints from everyone in all different styles and all different sorts, and that was sort of, I just loved hanging around that print table, and say, not trying to figure out who took those pictures, and then trying to converse with them and kind of learn from them, and that was again community. Now community is mostly online. But I'm going to definitely talk a lot about how we can kind of, night photography should not be done alone, and that you should really there's a lot more of communal ways to kind of experience it. So my website, like I said, I work at B&H here, but I also teach workshops and run a blog and a website, ruinism.com. So why the night? So the night fascinates me, but if we think about it, the darkness, the night, has fascinated us since the beginning of time. And most artists have sort of struggled with trying to capture that sort of night light. This is one of my favorite examples of a night image. It's a painting by Van Gogh, Starry Night Along the Rhone. And I love this image. You got the sort of the twinkling starlight, the twinkling stars. At the time, street lights had just really only been out for maybe 50 years, 30 years. Before that, people were just pretty much walking around with candles. So you didn't really go out that much. Street lamps opened up this whole new world to us. And I just really love how that these street lamps are reflecting in the water, and they reveal humankind in the corner here. So it's just a wonderful, wonderful image. And I find myself going back to this image, and even though we like star trails a lot, and those can be very dramatic, I find myself especially inspired by this image to go back and to try to make more celestial type images. So let's get to a little bit of the history. I always think it's important to know the history of whatever subject matter you're going to challenge. So the history of the night, really, at the beginning of photography, most of the ways we were capturing daguerreotypes, metal, then we went to glass plates. It wasn't until we actually had a film base and moved up to an ISO of about 12, 25, that the night was really available to successfully photograph. And in 1933, a Hungarian photographer living in France by the name of Bresai really did an amazing job of capturing the French nightlife. A lot of it was these sort of noir-esque shots of just the landscape and the people. And then quite a bit of it also was sort of the underbelly, the prostitutes and the nightlife of Paris. It turned into an amazing book. It's still, I think it's in its 10th edition now. It's called Paris at Night. And if you like photography and you like having a nice photography book collection, that is definitely in the top 10 books that one must have. The publishers really enjoyed it and its success that they asked one of the most popular photographers at the time in England, Bill Brandt, to do a version of it in London. And it's called London at Night. Now, most of Bill Brandt's work, if you're familiar with him, and most of this kind of was taking place during the World War, and so there's a lot of, he got a lot of amazing shots with just no city lights in the middle of like downtown, but with no city lights because they had curfew going on. But for some reason, Bill Brandt's book, it's only got one publication on it. And so if you ever find a copy of it and it's under $10,000, every once in a while you see it for like 100 because they don't know what they got. So get it. Now, Bill Brandt has tried an amazing amount of different styles. He was sort of a master in the darkroom, and he was able to make images shot during the day look like the night. He was definitely a trickster in the darkroom. So he has many collections and compilation books available. So you can get a good sense of his night work, or what looks like his night work, available either from the library or by purchasing one of his books. And then in America, so one of our first night photographers that really kind of pushed it another level was a commercial photographer living in New York at the time, O. Winston Lincoln. He's more in the 50s. Like I said, he's commercial, working with studio lights, but he had a love for steam engines. And during that 50s, early 60s time, the writing was sort of on the wall for steam engines. Cars were coming into vogue, airplane travel, and he took it upon himself as a project to document the steam trains in the Virginia area and kind of all along that area there. And this is a wonderful story about how we can sort of look at projects and how to attain it. And a lot of times what happens, and exactly what he did, he just started taking pictures of the trains near where they would stop and stuff like that. And then he sent the company samples of these images and said, hey, I really would love to document more. You know, if you're interested, let me know. And they were totally interested they needed any promotional materials they could get at the time. And he soon was granted full access to all their lines. So he has 2 books out on this, as well as a museum in Virginia. So if you ever get a chance to go down to the O. Winston Lincoln Museum, I'm still kind of, that's on my agenda as well. But if we look at this image, I really love this image, and I go back to this image talking to my students and talking to people, because this is not your typical night image. Most of the night stuff, like I said, and I'll talk about tonight, and what we think of in night photography is, again, those seconds, minutes, and hours. But if we look at this image, he froze a train. He froze a frame of the movie still. So that means he's shooting at least 500th of a second, probably 1,000th of a second to capture that. And yet it's well lit. So how is he doing this?
Flashlight.
Well, not flashlight. I mean, he's taking, you know, again, going back to kind of what, for those of you who are at David's talk today, he's taking his experience as a commercial photographer. He was familiar with studio lights. So he brought close to 200 lights around here to light up and freeze that train. Now, a lot of us don't have access to 200 lights, you know, but again, taking that one light or two lights out there and maybe doing an environmental portrait at night. I have a couple friends who are kind of doing that now, and we've never been able to capture night photographers in their environment because what are you going to do? Hold still for 3 minutes? You know, so you can get the ghost of a night photographer. That's easy. But again, and he lit the couple over here in the car. I mean, this is a great image. You can continue, let your eye wander about and just see, it talks about transportation, the Industrial Revolution, the coming and going, and it's a beautiful, beautiful image. Now looking at some modern night photographers, now it's funny because no one really calls themselves a night photographer. I think, you know, some people call themselves, you know, wedding or landscape or portrait photographers, but no one's really calling them night photographers. But hopefully, after today's presentation, I'll inspire you to at least call yourself, at least have that capability in your bag. You know, that you can reach in and say, hey, I have this. I know how to do this when the sun goes down. It's not just going to be a big flash of light. I know how to bring in the ambient, and I know how to do all this stuff because it's a very important thing to kind of have in your mindset, in your gear bag. Hiroshi Sugimoto, still alive today, has a studio in Manhattan as well as a studio in Japan. He's an amazing photographer. He's tried all sorts of techniques, but it's his theater project that really is to this day blows people away. He started it with an idea. He said, I wonder what would happen if I were to take an exposure for the entirety of a film. So he packed up, he's a large format photographer. He usually shoots 8x10 or 11x14 cameras you go under the wrap for. So he somehow snuck one of these large format cameras into a theater in the Lower East Side, went up to the balcony, set it up, and then when the movie started, he put it to bulb, click go, and then when the movie was over, he stopped the exposure. He had no idea, you know. But when he brought that single sheet of film home to his darkroom, he said the vision exploded in his eye. So what happened, as we can see, looking at the top picture right there, well, obviously the screen went white. It's overexposed. And that's fine, actually. It looks fine for that to be a bright white. But it's acting, you know, as a big bounce and bouncing the light back into the theater and lighting the theater. I'm sorry I don't have a bigger picture of this, but if you look closely, you can actually see in that image a lot of the ghosts of the people that are in the seats and sitting there. So he took this project and went forward with it, and it was an amazing time because it was the late 70s, early 80s, and it went all the way into the 90s, at a time when these beautiful theaters were kind of going away, and now all we have is cineplexes. So his project is really an amazing, great for historical value, and just beautiful, beautiful to take a look at. Now he took it a step further by then exploring the drive-in theaters as well, and here he was able to incorporate star trails and airplane trails into the image. So there's this sort of randomness that can come about and add something to the vision. If there is one photographer out there that we can kind of all look towards as the night photographer, it would probably be Michael Kenna. Okay, if you're not familiar with him, he has over 20 books, 30 calendars. Still alive today. He lives in the Northwest. He's from England, and he shoots with a Hasselblad. He still shoots film, and most of his images are square format and beautifully, beautifully printed, like 6x6 on an 8x10 sheet of paper. He's carried by one of the galleries here in New York, and I got a chance to spend 3 hours just pouring through those images, and they're just little, you know, things of beauty, like ornaments, and he focuses on shooting the landscape, but also man's influence on the landscape. Yeah, manscape, I guess we call it. This is an early picture. This is the Radcliffe Power Station. You can tell it's an early picture because it's a 35 millimeter crop. And again, going back to projects, this is probably at the beginning of his project. He was shooting from afar with a telephoto lens, shooting the power station in Radcliffe, and he was getting some amazing shots. So he decided to approach them and say, hey, these are the shots I'm getting. I would love to, have more access, and I would, gladly supply you, with these images for promotional materials, et cetera, et cetera. And that got him in a book called Radcliffe Power Station. So most of his stuff is a little bit similar to what we can kind of see here. He definitely incorporates the sky, the water, and like I said, most of his exposures are in the hours. So we're really kind of challenging what we can really see. And then a couple more modern photographers. These are both good friends of mine. First one at the top, Lance Kiemig, and the bottom one, Troy Pava. Lance was part of this new group of nocturnes that came about around 20 years ago when they all taught under the tutelage of Steve Harper, who offered the first class on night photography in San Francisco. And a bunch of the students that came out of that kind of band together and really started, they brought the first website called the Nocturnes, and then they started offering workshops mainly on the West Coast. Lance has now moved to the East Coast. Lance and I spoke actually at the Photo Plus Expo just recently. We were on a panel on night photography, but he's a great, great educator. He actually teaches now at the New England School of Photography. And then Troy also lives in the West Coast. He's a much sought after educator, as well as he's really, really set the bar for light painting. He had a theatrical background and was very well experienced with the lighting and gelling lights and stuff like that. And he brought that to his other love, which was of this abandoned, lost America. So he drives around in the deserts of California and Nevada, finding sort of abandoned ruins or junkyards and all this sort of stuff like that, and then lights these with these sort of, bright, not bright lights, but sort of gelled colored lights to kind of give it a very surreal quality to it. So both of these people have websites and are kind of putting out great information, offering workshops now as well. So, and then looking again at sort of the nightlife's influence on the modern world. Everyone remembers the Sprint commercials just a few years ago. Everyone loved those commercials because they were magical. How did you do that? That's wonderful. And that commercial itself spawned a whole generation of light writers and light drawers. If you look at the magazines on your Shack or when you download them, National Geographic Traveler especially, a lot of their covers, a lot of the times when people are shooting, notice it's at twilight, or it's at sunrise, or it's at night. It's really when we're sort of extending those exposures and getting a lot of interesting stuff going on, movement, reflection, star trails, etc. All right, so how do we do it? Most of us, when we're photographing at night, we pull out the camera, the flash automatically pops out, and voila, you get this. Wow, that's not that interesting. Most of those pop-up flashes that are on our cameras are only good for about 10 or 15 feet, and because it's doing flash and it's in auto mode, it's going to do it at a fraction of a second, like a 60th or 1/25th of a second, because the camera says, oh, I don't want to have any movement in it. However, if we turn it into slow sync mode, most of us have this, and I think it's actually in every camera, slow sync mode or rear curtain mode. Symbol will be somewhat like this, and you'll have it in your flash settings. What that does is that will flash, it'll still flash, but it'll also read what ambient light needs to come in, okay? So it'll now do an exposure, this was about a 60th of a second, this is about 3 seconds. So this is letting the ambient lights from all back here kind of kick in and light in that and fill in that background. I think we can safely say that this is a much more interesting picture. Okay, so if you don't have a tripod, if you're just kind of at a party or at a, outside, you want to get a little bit more interesting shot at night, slow sync is the way to go. Usually our second next, fallback is to bump up our ISOs. We can only we sort of need to, sometimes we need to freeze that action. So we can't really do, slower than 30th or 60th of a second. When we go as low as we can go on our apertures, but we're still not getting enough light. So we raise up our ISOs. And that works, for the most part. Cameras are getting better. Higher ISOs are definitely getting better. That was sort of the bane of digital photography with the high ISOs past 400 just only 3 or 4 years ago. But now you can really shoot safely at 1600 and 3200 ISO pretty well. And it's great for sort of in bars when you don't want to have that obtrusive light flash. But if we really zoom in and look at that image quality, and this was shot on a D700, which is one of the best cameras for night photography. Here we have ISO 6400, and this is ISO 200. And obviously, the higher ISOs are more granular, they're more noisy, and every camera has an optimal ISO, and that's where I want you guys to get to that optimal. In most cases, if you can, get to that optimal ISO. That optimal ISO is usually the lowest ISO that you have before you get to ones that say low. So it's the lowest number ISO that you can get to. Okay, so it's not the low 1, low 2. It would be 100. Typically, it's 100 for Canon or 200 for Nikon. Typically. All right. So what do we need to get started? Well, first of all, we need a camera. And the challenge with night photography is that you'll also, with your digital camera, that is, it's a Herculean effort to take long exposures, to hold that shutter open for those seconds. It like drains the battery like crazy. So getting extra batteries is a very important thing. Having 1 or 2, if you have these bigger SLRs, you can usually get through a whole night of night shooting. But if you sort of have just a standard size, having an extra 1 or 2, depending on how long you want to shoot, it's definitely worth it. Now, I'm also a big fan of film. I still shoot film to this day, and when I go out on a dedicated night shoot, I pretty much bring 2 rigs, 1 film and 1 digital, because I'm getting 2 different ways of shooting with that. And a lot of us still have film cameras. A lot of us haven't sold them, and we could just dust them off on the shelves, or the used department is right around the corner, and there's some great deals always going on. If I were to choose a film camera, I would choose one that is not battery dependent. And there's quite a few out there. These 2 I own personally, and they're my favorites. The first one is the middle one right there is the Nikon F3. It does take a battery, but the battery is just for metering. You don't need the battery to lift the shutter, okay? But one of my all-time favorites is the Mamiya C220, and it's a medium format camera. You get about 12 shots per roll of film, and no battery whatsoever. And I like actually having 12 shots or under 20 shots, because typically when we're doing a night shoot with these longer exposures, especially with film, our average exposure is going to be anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour or 2. So one night shoot, you get 2 shots, 4 shots, 5 shots. So 36 shots, I'll be waiting a whole year to develop that roll of film if I dedicate it just to night. So and these Mamiya C220s, there's the C330s, you can get those for like $300 or $400 with a lens. So they're a great deal. A lens, obviously a lens is very important. I would also recommend getting a manual focus lens. For Nikon users, you're in luck because a lot of their older manual focus lenses are still compatible with their cameras today. And that's great. You can get those for $50 to a couple $100. Zeiss has offered a really nice selection of manual focus lenses. A lot of people are talking about them in the video world because the cinematography, we're not autofocusing when we're making these movies with our SLR cameras now, but we're manually focusing, and they're smooth, they're silky, the bokeh is beautiful. They are expensive. They do come at a premium. Usually they're anywhere from $800 to $1,800. But investing in one of those, because autofocus at night, how does autofocus work? It looks for contrast. A lot of times it's too dark, it's too dim at night for there to be any contrast. So, I have a whole section dedicated to focusing, but having at least one manual focus lens in your bag is a good thing. Whatever lens you have, make sure, don't forget your hood, okay? We always think of using our hoods during the day, but they're just as important at the night. Yes, we don't have the sun that's has a possibility of flaring in our image, but there's street lamps, and guess what? The moon gives us a crazy flare as well. So utilizing, putting on that hood or getting a hood for your lens and using it for night is a great, great thing. Another must is a tripod. Really, there's three things. You need a tripod, a camera, and a cable release. But the tripod is sort of the foundation. Now there's two types of tripods out there. There's aluminum tripods, and then there's carbon fiber tripods. Aluminum tripods are about $100 to $300, and carbon fiber usually start at $300 and go up to $800. But there's some great deals out there. I'm a big fan of Gitzo, though I do like B&H just started carrying this new line called Oben. So both of those I would recommend for their carbon fibers. Also a good thing, as we're now getting, this is the season for night photography right now because it gets dark at 5 o'clock. So we get more hours of shooting before we get really too tired. In the summer when we have to wait till 9 o'clock, it's, sure it's nicer weather out, but we only have maybe 3 or 4 hours until we're tired. So, but getting a good tripod, and then I'm a big fan of ball heads. I know some people like the 3-way or the 5-way pan heads, but I'm a big fan of the ball head. It's just a little bit smoother, a little bit easier to use. And again, like I said, the last thing that sort of you need to have is a dedicated cable release. Something that plugs in, not those ones that you press to trigger. Okay, you need one that plugs in and that you can lock down. And what this does, every camera, every SLR camera, the longest it'll expose for is 30 seconds. Okay, then you get to B for bulb mode. Okay, and that's where the cable release is going to come into play, because you can we have cable releases that are about $50 to $100 and plus more that look like this, that you can kind of set the time. It's an intervalometer. It has a few more functions that you can do with it. Or there's just the simple shut and lock one. So you can get the dedicated Nikon and Canon one, but again, I've also seen, we carry a brand, Peerstone and Velo, that offer them, you can get just a standard cable release like that for $10. Or these timed ones for about $50, as opposed to Nikon and Canon's $130. So I usually roll with 2 cable releases. The $10 one, nicely enough, is not dependent upon the batteries, so that's usually my backup. And then I use the larger one. It runs on 2 AAA batteries. But I always bring extra batteries for that as well. A backup to the backup. Now we talked about using the film cameras. What kind of film do I use? Because different films are going to act differently when you expose them for a longer time. My 2 favorite films are both by Fuji. For black and white, I'm a big fan of Fuji Acros, A-C-R-O-S. It's a 100 speed black and white film that its reciprocity factor doesn't go until about 2 minutes. And I'm going to save that, hold the reciprocity. I'm going to have a whole slide for that. And then my favorite color film is actually a slide film by the name of Astia, also 100 speed. But both those have wonderful color renditions for the night. It's a Fuji Astia. Yep, and you got the Acros. Now we also need, a lot of times we're going to need some light, and a good thing to have at night is flashlights. Not just one, I usually carry 2 or multiple ones. But if you're going to have 2 flashlights, one should be sort of just like a mag light, something cheap that we probably already have in your house. And usually those mag lights are like 4 to 8 lumens. So that's a good light to kind of just look in your black camera bag to see your black gear, in the night. Or just to kind of look around, and it's not going to have a big throw. You're probably not going to do too much light painting with it, but it actually will kind of help you just get familiar with your surroundings. I also recommend getting a flashlight that's at least 40 lumens and the 40 to 80 lumens. I'm a big fan of Surefire. We carry those here as well. They're sort of military grade ones, but they can be very, very bright, and you could be doing some light painting of things 100 yards away with something like that. So that's cool, and I have a bunch of slides to show that off as well. But at least carry 2, so you can kind of have that diversity, or versatility. Also don't forget to bring a flash. You're not going to have that flash on your camera. You're going to be triggering it And you don't need these radio triggers or anything like that. You can just trigger it, remotely triggering it just with your hand. But there's sort of a difference between painting with flashlights and painting with flash, and both offer different ways of sort of filling in that space. But bringing your flash as well is a good thing. And then all the accessories that go with flash are important, like a snoot, something that's going to wrap around and we can sort of control. Usually flash goes out like that, so if we can kind of control it and get it more of a beam is good. Gels are a good thing as well, so we can either match color temperature or just add a different sort of color to the scene. This is an interesting item that Lance introduced me to. It's called the Flare Buster. And it's basically a black card that is on this bendable arm. And you can put this arm into your hot shoe. And so this saved my life when I was shooting a street scene, and there was a lamp there, and that I just kept getting flare. So I was able to put this card, right, the hood wasn't helping. I really needed to, put that card right in there. Now, you could spend $30 and get the Flash Buster and get sort of a bendable arm, but I'll also say you can also go to the art store and get a black, a sturdy cardboard, black cardboard. I'm a big fan of. I usually have a couple pieces of those around, and I'll show you, and I'll definitely showcase a few techniques you can use with black cards at night. This is called a spirit level or a bubble level. And these are good, especially if you're doing landscapes at night. We always want to make sure that our horizon line is level. We don't want to go home and just be like, I spent an hour taking this picture, setting it up, and now I have to crop 20% of it out because it's crooked. So some cameras have it in the back of their screen, but I'm a big fan of also just having it, and that's where you're going to kind of take your mag light and make sure that it's all level. All right, and then let's see, and then finally, a compass. So I know a lot of us have that on our phones nowadays, but knowing where north, west, south, and east are going, that's another good thing to have. So time and how we see it. Again, this is a typical picture I think that most of us would be probably happy to take, and as you can tell, this is not Paris. This is actually Las Vegas, Paris. And you can tell that because the water is green at St. Patrick's Day. So I shot this with a point and shoot camera. I bent down, kind of got a dramatic composition, and I was like, oh, that's good. But I'm like, wait a minute, this is 200th of a second. What about, again, challenging time? And this is 15th of a second. Now the water's moving quite fast, so 15th of a second gives it a little bit more feeling. We're drawn to that a little bit more. We can actually feel or hear the water flowing. So even just kind of, in this I was able to do without a tripod. You can actually see under, the fountain as well. But again, challenging that time. And now let's look at another, we were talking about daytime a little bit, but how we can do that during the day. This is in a sort of a typical area where we have there's a lot of trees, so we get that sort of dappled light, and there's a stream coming by. And by maxing out my aperture to f22, I'm able to take away a lot of the light, and I put it down to my optimal ISO, which was 200. And that gave me a half a second exposure, which wasn't bad. That's good. It was on a tripod. But by using a tripod and filters, we can really extend that time. And these are 3 different types of filters that can get you effects more like this. This is a 2 seconds at f22. There's circular polarizer. Most people, that's sort of the second most popular filter after you have a UV filter. And basically it's 2 filters stacked on top of each other. And if you rotate them, it takes away about 2 stops of light, but it also cuts through glare and enhances the sky. It'll turn it usually a deeper shade of blue, but you have to watch out because sometimes it turns it a little too purple. Okay, so just be aware of that. There are also neutral density filters, and they come in 2 different families. There's the graduated neutral density filters, which are great for doing like sort of sunset, sunrises, or there's just the big stoppers that you kind of screw on, and that basically they're opaque filters that take away stops of light. And in that family, there's just recently came out within the last year is the Vario neutral density. And basically, when most filters, they'll be rated like this. They'll call it a 0.3. 0.3 takes away 1 stop of light. 0.6 takes away 2 stops of light. 0.9 takes away 3 stops of light. 1.24 and so forth and so on. You can get filters that take away up to 13 stops of light. I own a circular polarizer, so that gets me 2 stops, and then I own a 10-stop neutral density filter. And a 10-stop neutral density filter will pretty much, at noon on a bright sunny day, that's giving me about an 8-second exposure. So if you want to get that Times Square shot with, without any traffic or with minimal people or ghosting people, that's kind of the filter that you need. Yep?
If you just stack and cross-polarize 2 polarizing filters, what will that make?
Well, it's funny you should ask what by stacking 2 polarizing filters will do, because technically that's what a varioneutral density is.
Yeah, okay.
However, one thing you have to learn about stacking filters is vignetting for those wide-angle lenses. And again, I would probably buy the varioneutral density before stacking those 2 ones, because you're rotating now 2 objects as opposed to 1, and you got to really watch where those colors are going to go. Okay? But here you can say this one, I was able to, again, use one of those filters and get a longer exposure. We can kind of see through the rocks and get a little bit more movement up in the leaves as well, and create more of a dramatic look. Now, taking another look at time and what it does, I want to kind of show you, this is at night, okay? And these are clouds, and I want you to watch the clouds. This is a 1-second exposure. This is a 2-second exposure. 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, and a little airplane, and then 4 minutes. And notice at 4 minutes, we can actually see the hair on my sensor, because what I'm doing, in order to extend the time, I'm shooting this at f/22. And if we know about apertures, we know that apertures, the smaller the number, the more depth they create. And we always think about the depth they create. If you want everything in focus, stop down all the way, and everything from 1 foot to infinity is going to be in focus. But we don't think about what's going to be on focus. It creates the same sort of depth on the inside of the camera as well. So as you notice, you didn't see this, you didn't see that dirt. You didn't see it there, and that was 16. You definitely don't see it there at 11. So it's watch out when we kind of go to those maximum apertures. Make sure your sensor's clean. So here's a look at sort of all of them, and I'm not going to say, okay, this one's great or this one's great. Each one's it's going to be what you want to create with the scene, okay? And of course, wind is going to play. I'm not saying always at 15 seconds it's going to look like that. It all depends on the wind, how breezy it is outside, how quickly those clouds are moving. But definitely pay attention to clouds, because I think where these are interesting, sort of when we get to here, it just is too schmeary. Okay, a general rule of thumb that I follow is, if I am going to incorporate clouds, I usually don't go over 4 minutes of exposure, because it just, for the most part, it gets a little too schmeary for it. Okay? All right, so we're going to go into our camera. Now, again, most of what I'm talking about now is really night photography. You really need a digital, an SLR camera, whether it be film or digital. Point and shoot, you're really, really limited, because a lot of these features are not capable with that. You can get away with some, but it really is worth, if you really want to be serious with it, is to have a SLR camera. Because with that SLR camera, we can get into our M for manual mode, and then also stick it to B for bulb mode, and get past, again, those 30 seconds. And when we look at our exposures, for those of us, most of us shoot in aperture priority, I think. We sort of see depth, and we choose that accordingly. But when we go into M for manual mode, here's our meter. It's either over here or over there. And we just, for the most part, we want to line it up around that 0, area. So that's sort of how we're reading the meter in manual mode. All right, reciprocity. I'm going to take a little sip of water for this one. Reciprocity means relationship. Okay? And with photography, there's three things that control our exposure. And these three things, in order for successful photography, you really need to be comfortable with these three things. And those are your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. Okay? And if you move if you've metered and you've got the proper exposure, but there's not enough depth to it. So say we take this exposure, all these exposures are letting in the same amount of light. So they're filling up that sensor with the same amount of light. They are equal to each other. They have that relationship. Okay? Now it's what we want to do with it. Do we want to go to a lower exposure? Or do we want to have less or more depth? That's where we sort of take control of it. So if I take a picture at 500 of a second at 2.8, but I'm like, okay, I like it. Exposure looks good, histogram looks good, but I want a little bit more depth to it. I'm taking a picture of that person, and then like 2 or 3 feet behind them, it's starting to blur too much. I want a sense of the place. So I know that, okay, f8 is a good area to kind of get, you'll get enough depth there. So what I'm showing you here are full stop increments between these are the standard apertures, the standard shutter speeds, and we'll talk about the standard ISOs right now. So I'll go from 2.8 to 4 to 5.6 and to 8. So that's 3 stops of light. Now, as you can see by the diagram, the aperture is becoming smaller, and the number is becoming higher. And what it's doing is it's taking away 3 stops of light. So if that's the right exposure, I've got to put those 3 stops of light somewhere else. And the immediate response is probably to apply it to our shutter speed. So I go from 500th of a second, 3 stops, 250, 125, and 1/60th of a second. Again, that will equal the same amount. It'll be the same exposure. Now, shutter speeds and ISOs are very easy to figure out because you're either those full stop increments, because you're either doubling or halving. So easy math. I like that. Apertures, you just have to learn. You have to memorize them. And right here are, again, the standard, most commonly used apertures, ISOs, and shutter speeds. Well, shutter speeds, I'm showing you stuff for longer exposures here, okay? But most lenses are gonna fall somewhere between 2.8 and 1.2. Some of those prime lenses are gonna get a little bit, they're called fast lenses because they let in 2 more stops of light than a standard camera does. Most standard cameras, if you get the kit lens with it, it's a 3.5 to 5.6. It means it changes as you zoom. And that, that 3.5 is obviously somewhere between that, and it goes between these two ones. Whenever you buy a camera, I always say go buy a 51.4 lens with it as well. That's somewhere between, 51.4 or 51.8. That's anywhere from $100 to $400, and you get a nice fast lens with it. Okay, so I want people to really understand this. So we're gonna do a couple tests here. So let's just say I have an exposure that looks good, and it's at 1600 ISO at 5.6 at 15 seconds. Okay? I look at the back of the screen. It looks good. 5.6, I'm happy with the depth, but I want to go to my optimal ISO. It's, maybe I can't see the grain on the back of the screen, but I know for a fact that I want to go to my optimal ISO. So I can usually, if I'm in manual mode, I press my ISO button, and I know, okay, I'm going to go down to my optimal ISO, which for this case, let's say is 100. So I go half of 1600 is 800, 400, 200, and then 100. So 4 stops of light that I just took away from the exposure, and I need to apply this, and I can apply it to apertures and shutter speeds, or apertures and shutter speeds, or I can do 1 here, 3 there. I try to keep it simple. You can get confused. It's dark out. Okay, 5.6. We're happy with that. We're at 15 seconds. So if I add 4 more stops of light to 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes. Everyone got me? Everyone with me on this one? Okay. We'll do one more example with visual. Now in visual. So this was a shot I took a few years ago. There's a lamp, there's a street lamp right behind that tree, and I really kind of liked how dramatic the light was kind of kicking back the shadow. So I set up a test shot. Oftentimes at night I want to take a test shot before committing to those longer exposures. So because it's a test shot, I raise up my ISOs to make my sensor more sensitive. Okay, and I let in more light by going. My fastest aperture was 2.8, so I'm like, let the light in. I want to just make this a short exposure so I can fix it and then go from there. And then I took what my meter was telling me, and your meter's in your camera. Especially by raising up that ISO, you're making your camera more sensitive to light, and the meter does a pretty good job. Those old film cameras don't do a good job metering at night. A lot of times you'll have to either use your past experiences or a light meter sometimes at night. But digital, the great thing about digital is the digital sensors, by making them more sensitive, the meter acts a lot better than it ever has before. So I took this shot and I look at it in the back of the screen, and I was like, that looks pretty good. I want to slightly change the composition, and I think it's a little too hot in the middle. So I think it's one stop overexposed. So if I want to go to, first I want to do two things to this one. This one we're throwing two wrenches into it. First of all, I want to go down to my optimal ISO, which is 1600, so 800, 400, and for me it was 200. Okay, so that's 3 stops of light. Now 2.8, I want to definitely, 2.8, by using, we kind of talked about how f/22, you want to oftentimes, the middle apertures, those f8, f11 apertures are oftentimes our optimal apertures for a lens, and that's where you're going to get the best quality from. In this case, I wasn't trying to do anything with a lack of depth or anything like that, so I said, let me get to an optimal ISO on it, and so I said, let me get to f8. So if I go from 2.8 to 4, and then I go to 5, 6, and then I go to 8. So 6 stops of light, but I said I was 1 stop over, so I'm going to take away the thumb. So we got 5 stops that I needed to apply to the next picture. So this is what I got. I went down to ISO 200. So 5 stops of light going from 8 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes. Voila. And you get some nice little star trails in there with a 4-minute exposure. Adjusted that compositions a little bit, and it's not as hot in the center. Now I know it seems a little confusing, and I know you don't want to be counting on your fingers and your toes in the night. So before I answer any questions, I want to show you the next slide, because the next slide is the key to everything. This is going to make your night exposures a lot better. Okay? So for those shooting with a camera that has an ISO setting of 6400 ISO and goes down to 100, doing the math on the ISO couldn't be easier. Basically, the seconds equal the minutes. It's sort of the 6-stop rule, I call it. So 1 second at 6400 equals 1 minute at 100. Now, if you're like me, I use a Nikon camera, so it only goes to 200 ISO. So instead of 6400, I got to get 6 stops away. I have to go to 12,800, or what they call high 1 in most cameras. So again, I'll do a high 1 test. And here I always keep my aperture at anywhere between 5.6 and f11. So that way, the math is easy. The reciprocity, the relationship between the ISOs and my shutter speeds. I go 3 this way, or it's just seconds to minutes. Now, when it gets to the fractions of a second, you have to count the 6 again. But if you have seconds, they will equal minutes. So 10 seconds equals 10 minutes. 3 seconds equals, we're there. Okay, any questions? Good.
I have one over here.
Okay.
When you're playing with the different combinations,
Yep.
basically you're still ultimately letting in the same amount of light.
Correct. Once you find the correct amount of light, right?
So what is the quality, like in the last picture, when
Yep.
the light was hot
Yep.
and you're reducing, you're playing with the numbers, the light softens even though it's still getting ultimately the same.
Well, I took away one stop of light in this previous picture.
But the extra time that you gave it still allows it to stay softer enough.
It can get right. Things can be softer. We'll kind of talk about what we can do with apertures and length of exposures in a little bit as well. But things can soften. Shadows will definitely soften, especially if you're using moonlight, because moonlight's going to move. So instead of having, a light coming in from this way, it's going to be a light coming in from this way, and that definitely softens things up quite a bit.
Do you get
Yep.
reciprocity in digital?
In digital, you do not get reciprocity. But I'm going to get to that slide. It's something else.
Maybe a similar question. Would the difference between the film meters be reciprocity failure?
Yes. And that is the next slide. So let's get to that.
Another question
Yeah.
before you go on.
Yeah.
When you set the test shot,
Yep.
1600 and f2,
Yep.
right? So you set the aperture priority and then you let the camera say.
I'm all in manual mode. And I advise everyone be in a manual mode. Manual mode, when we look at that meter and try to match up the needle with it, it's going to do a little bit better than aperture priority. Aperture priority is going to fail, especially after 30 seconds of exposure.
We didn't discuss how you chose 8 seconds.
I chose my the ISO,
Yeah.
and I chose my aperture, and then I adjusted the shutter speed until I saw that needle right around that 0.
Okay.
Okay? So, but what I do now, and that was early on, now what I do is I go all the way up to 6400 or high 1. I shoot 5.6 f8, f11, and then you move my shutter speed till when I get to like a 0 point.
For your test shot.
Yep, for my test shot.
So ISO up all the way
Yep.
and
Aperture at a mid-range aperture.
oh, the mid-range.
At a mid-range, I mean, that's your call. Mid-range, again, I'm looking for optimal image quality. Okay?
Yeah.
I don't understand how it is possible that you can have the reciprocity like that with the same aperture, with different aperture.
This
Doesn't impress more if you open more?
aperture, when you move your aperture, you're taking away light or adding light. The same with shutter speeds, the same with ISOs.
Yeah, but how is possible is that
If I keep my aperture the same, I'm leaving it out of the picture. Yes, I'm making it simple. Instead of thinking about 3 things and counting, like this, I'm thinking about 2 things. So it makes it simpler. Okay, and I'm going to get to the reciprocity a little bit more. I want to talk just a few seconds about composition. Composition is always an important thing to think about, but now at night, when we have time at our hands and we have movement, a lot of more movement to capture, it's really important to kind of look to that movement, look to water, look to those clouds, look to the trees that are moving. This is the 69th Street transfer bridge. It's right here in Manhattan. That's looking over to Jersey. It's a wonderful, it's a historic National Historic Landmark right now. I went up there, it's an open park, I shot there, and I was shooting more on this bridge, but then I saw the trees kind of just moving and flowing. I said, that would be really cool to kind of just shoot through there. It's kind of leading you in there. The cropping is, the composition is leading you through there, and then the movement's just making it smoother. And also the movement on the water is causing more reflections. So having something solid oftentimes heightens the movement. And that's what I've always told, everyone. Make sure if you're gonna have movement, put something solid. That'll heighten it. Now, of course, all rules are made to be broken, and I challenged that. I was down in South Beach, right? Can't you tell? South Beach, Florida, right? And I wanted to be like, I want to make a Rothko painting at night. And I had to shoot. I definitely had to shoot this way because there's definitely a lot of boats, and boats have lights, and lights will always be a permanent. If there's any light in the image, it's going to be permanent. So I had to sort of pick and choose the area that I needed to shoot at. But here we have, this is just a water movement. This is about a 2 to 4 minute exposure, and then we have the sky out there, and this is just all movement. And it's sort of, right, there's nothing solid there, but it's, so I'm going against what I've often said, but it's still, it's sort of a soothing picture. It's a relaxing picture. So, there are rules, there are compositional rules, but definitely challenge them. Focusing in the dark. Right, I kind of touched upon this a little bit. I said getting a manual focus lens is definitely going to make it a lot easier for you. However, when you have another great use of that high power, that 40 to 80 lumen flashlight, is to help you focus. This is Haystack Rock along the Oregon coast, and I shot this with a 4x5 camera. Okay, so here I am under the curtain, and I was using my flashlight, and it was able to really light up this area for me to focus on. Okay, and a lot of times what we can do with our autofocus cameras is you can shine a beam of light, as long as it's just not like this wall, right? If I focus on this, well, there's no contrast. This wall is one tone. What I would have to do is, look towards, the screen, black and white. That's something. If I shine a light right on that, then I can press halfway down, lock in my focus, now change the lens from autofocus to manual focus, because we've locked down our focus. But we need to immediately change it to manual focus, because the next time we press on it, that flashlight's not going to be on. So we don't want it to search again in the dark for it. And inevitably you will. I've done it. I still do it today. But make sure to switch it from autofocus to manual focus. If you're new to manual focus, almost all these SLR cameras have a diopter adjuster. So you want to look through that and make sure things are in focus. Make sure those focal points that are in there that are black and sometimes light up green or red, make sure those are in focus. That's something you do by just adjusting the diopter on there, because that way you'll know that the screen is now adjusted to your eye, and that anything that you'll see manually focused will be true. And with wide-angle lenses, there's something called hyperfocus. And unfortunately, this has kind of gone to the wayside, especially with Canon. There's very little hyperfocusing going around, but a lot, when we had those, especially the manual focus lenses, what we had these hyperfocal charts on our lenses, okay? And this is what, the lens is up here. This is sort of almost near where it attaches to your camera. And here you see, that is where it is in focus, and you can always say, okay, I'm 5 feet away from that subject. But now you see the apertures listed on both sides of the lens. So most people at night will say, a default is, hey, if the subject matter is 20 or 30 feet away, just put it in infinity. Okay, that's an easy way. You don't have to do any focus. If the subject is 20, 30 feet away, I can set my infinity to the line. And even autofocus cameras now still have that line and still have that chart. But what they don't have is this part. And if you do have an older Nikon lens, or the Zeiss lenses come with this, this is great, because if you look at this, what this says is if I focus just on infinity, it's really just putting my depth of field is from 5 feet, because I'm shooting at f/16, 5 feet to infinity. However, if I hyperfocus, and instead of putting the infinity mark on the hash mark here, I put it on the aperture I'm using, which is f/16, I have everything in focus from this 16 to that 16, which is less than 3 feet. So I'm gaining a longer focal range. So more stuff is going to be in focus in the foreground. Okay? All right, white balance. White balance, it can be tricky at night. Definitely you want to get off AWB, which is auto white balance, or average white band, I think it used to be called. Basically, the key to the white balance, shoot raw. Okay, that way there's a lot of programs now that can adjust that now. Put it in a good starting point is to put it in the tungsten setting, which is this bulb setting, the fourth one down right over there. You can use, a lot of cameras have live view now, so you can actually look on the back and kind of scroll through various white balances and see which one's right for you. I personally like to dial in a number, and it's usually somewhere between the 3100 Kelvin to 3500. Creates a cooler, a bluer night. This was a little tricky because I had mercury vapor lights over here and I had sodium vapor lights over here. Sodium vapor is around 2000 K, mercury vapor is around, I think, 6000, 7000 K, so it's like, okay, there's no halfway meeting point. And so I just had to kind of I shot somewhere like around that 3500 range and kind of just made it a little bit, that's where you're getting the pinks and the blues, and it was overcast. Of course, the clouds are reflecting that and kind of just enhancing that as well. So, but again, usually a tungsten or dialing it in that 31 to 3500 range is going to do really good.
You can modify that in processing.
You could definitely modify it as well. But here's the thing with white balance is white balance actually does affect your exposure. And if you're if you're a little off, it's all right. But if you're actually 3 or 4, stops away on the white balance, then it's actually affecting, your brightness and your darkness in your picture. So you don't want to be too off, So don't lose your night vision. Set your camera LCDs a little bit lower. Don't have them so bright because you don't want to be looking at the back of the screen and then come back and look at the scene and be like, okay, let me wait about 3 to 5 seconds or a minute. Also, your phones. A lot of us are using our phones as compasses, as timers, and all this other stuff, or checking email during an hour-long exposure. Set that to a low as well, because you don't want to be looking at your phone and doing that, and then look up to the scene and be like, again, I can't see for 3 to 5. So keeping that night vision clean. Mirror lockup and self-timer. These come into play a little bit in night photography. They're more for landscape. Mirror lockup, basically what that does is it'll lock up the mirror. A lot of times when we're looking through an SLR camera, we're looking through a chamber and down into a reflection that's on the mirror. There's a little vibration sometimes when the mirror comes up. And it really affects images. It could possibly affect images from 1/8 of a second to about 8 seconds. After that, the exposure is so long that any sort of vibration that's going to happen is going to be nullified. Okay, self-timer. If you have that, if you don't have a cable release and you have to press the camera, then I would definitely set it on a self-timer mode. Because basically what it's going to do is instead of any vibration of you pressing and triggering the camera physically, it's going to not do it for 2 seconds to 10 seconds afterwards. If you're on a cable release, you don't need that 2-second delay. Scout your location. This is also a very important thing to do. Scout it during the day. This is the Renwick Smallpox Hospital. So again, not too far from here, out on Roosevelt Island. And I shot this image about 5 years ago in February. So the sun was setting around, at that time, around 5:30. I'd scouted, I'd gone to the park, the Renwick Hospital, the South Park down there a few times during the day. So I saw it and I really loved this building. I said, wouldn't this be cool to shoot at night? But the park closes at night. That's all it says. Park closes at dusk. So, and there's a big gate, like 30, 40 feet. So I'm like, okay, I don't want to spend the night here, so let me scout it out. So I left work early one day. Can we edit that off of the, and I went over to scout out the location. I got there around 4:30. So I had an hour to shoot and then a little bit of the twilight for another half an hour to shoot. And I just brought my point and shoot camera this time because it's a scouting mission. I'm sort of looking at the lighting. I'm looking at what shots work. I'm looking for any possible security in this case. And a police car went by around 6:30 as I was kind of shooting through this fence on here. Everything's legal. Police car goes by, circles around, and comes back, and he goes, "Hey, big guy, we're closing up." I said, "Can you give me about 2 minutes, and then I'll be right out?" He said, "No problem." So, true to my form, I finished my exposure. I didn't stay and try to take advantage of it. I finished my exposure, wrapped up. I felt good about it, packed it up, and then went out, and he locked the gate behind me. Really, really nice experience. So the next day I went there and I went with my friend. And guess what? It snowed. And he got the winning shot that day. It's a friend of mine by the name of Andre. And I was sort of really, the fence was sort of annoying me. So I was really focused on shooting through the fence. And he was like, he took a step back, shot wide angle. And here's a cool thing again, when I talked about flashes and flashlight. He used a flash and popped it, just manually, popped it about 3 to 4 times to forever freeze the snow, which is white and very reflective in the scene. Okay, so you definitely got a great scene. And again, we can see here, though I think they've adjusted it now, but wow, look at the white balance difference between these three lights that are shining up and onto the castle there. 6:30, same cop car comes around, does his little loop, comes back down, and we got about 5 inches of snow on the ground now. And he's like, all right, big guy, we're closing up. Yeah, he doesn't see the little guy over there. And I go, hey, can you give us a lift to the train station? And he's like, yeah, no problem. So we quickly pack up our stuff, get in the back of the cop car, which was my first time in the back of the cop car. Talk about that later. That's another seminar. It was on my honeymoon, though. And good results, though. So, and he dropped us off at the train station, and we actually ended up shooting around there for another 2 hours before heading home. But it was a really good experience. I mean, listen, you're going to see strange things at night. You're going to encounter security officers, police, all sorts of things at night, and just don't be defensive. Don't be offensive. Just try to bring sample photographs of what you're doing. You're not a vandal. That's going to be, of course, the first assumption. But don't be overly defensive as well. I was shooting with some people the other night, and they were like, if we see anyone, we're running. I'm like, I'm not running. I'm not running. I'm not going to run away from a scene. Even if I am trespassing, I'm not going to run. I'll gladly approach them and figure it out. And say, I'm sorry, I apologize. It's really cool. Look what I'm doing. Okay? So, and I've never had a bad experience that way. So, another key is to arrive before sunset. Okay? I scouted out that location, but get there and shoot during that sunset time, that twilight time. You're going to get some great shots, and you're going to be able to sort of get yourself situated, and get familiar with your camera again, and just make sure everything's in the right place, and get a little operating time during the day. This is, of course, San Francisco, Golden Gate Bridge, I was with a workshop over there, and Canon was with us, and they came with, and they brought. I said, hey, I know this great spot. I scouted out because I lived in San Francisco. I know a great spot to do some great night work. And so Canon was like, I got a bunch of lenses, let's go. And so we had a great time kind of shooting over there and getting that and getting some great shots. This is on, we talked about Troy. Troy and a friend of mine, Joe, teach these workshops in junkyards. And again, this is, we get full legal access to these junkyards. And this was great. This was during an equinox. So when the sun and the moon are up at the same time, and the moonrise, I was able to get the moonrise, and again, scout out a little bit before what works. Oftentimes what shots work during the day are gonna look even better during the night. But when we're also scouting, look for street lamps. Where are gonna be those trouble spots at night? Things will look different, but oftentimes good shots in the day will be even better at night. And finally, don't shoot alone. Kind of talked about the community experience a little bit. At the beginning, when I was doing night photography about 8 or 10 years ago, it was sort of a very, oh, I've got this location. No one's going to know about it, and it's mine, blah, 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 blah. Listen, the world's too small these days. And it's about really, now for me, it's about sharing the experience. This is in San Francisco again. This is a subway station, and this is not a subway station that I had to, look out for the third rail or jump down. This was actually, you could walk right up to it. About 15 feet this way is the street. But I had scouted it out. I knew that the train stopped running at 1 o'clock in the morning. And sometimes people would walk, obviously, up into the next neighborhood. It was about a 1.5 mile walk through there, and obviously people have been there because of the graffiti and everything else. But we planned out this. We had our friend here who was the model, but it was also partially her idea, this shoot. And then there was another photographer with me as well. So it was the three of us out there working together. And because it was an illegal shot, we were quick about it. And this was film. And I think I got about 6 shots off in about 15 minutes, and then we were done. And out of all those six shots, they all worked. It was just like, which one I want to use. So again, obviously there's a lot of light kicking off, from the lights inside the tunnel. But again, don't shoot alone. Right now, I teach workshops, and I bring groups, or I go with a community of friends, and we'll go out and we'll shoot together. And it's really cool to challenge ourselves. We'll go to that same location, and it really makes us up our game And it's kind of like, we'll either post them to Flickr or we'll blog about it or do something else, and and it's amazing. I'll say, I didn't even see that. Where was that? And we'll kind of, we're not going to set up 6 tripods right next to each other and take the same shot, right? Okay, that person's got that one. I'm going to go look for something else. Oftentimes, even if you just look behind you, above you, or below, there's interesting shots everywhere. All right, how to figure out kind of digital exposures at night. We kind of touched upon this a little bit. But again, using your histogram. This is sort of a shot that most of us would be happy with. Again, it exemplifies the night. It's dark, and we didn't overexpose those street lamps. And that's what our histogram looks like, which it's not the best looking histogram. Histograms, we want to kind of avoid these spikes, especially when they're spiked on the end. Now these are over here on the right-hand side. That's obviously our shadows, and then over here is our highlights. So you're not going to get many highlights at night, unless you have, like, again, a street lamp or something like that. But a better histogram is something like this, which is sort of just moundy and reaching across. Now again, this one is the correct histogram, but that picture doesn't look, it definitely looks overexposed. So what we can do by assessing those shadows and highlights is we can take both of those shots and, of course, combine them together. And there's a few different ways. Obviously, there's HDR, and that's becoming even, it's definitely been popular, and now more and more people are doing it at night. There is some issues with HDR at night, especially if you have moving objects. Obviously, it's hard to kind of combine those together if you have moving skies or boats or something else like that going on. It can be a hard thing to do. But you can also easily stack these images or, and bracket and then merge and get the most out of both of them. Okay? Street lights. So again, I was talking to someone earlier about this, and street lights, oftentimes when we shoot the street at night, how do we, especially at the beginning, it can be hard to deal with these highlights and the lowlights, okay? And oftentimes what I'll tell people is like, just look for an area that's just all the same tone. Oftentimes at the beginning, just warm up with that. Don't challenge yourself so much to kind of figure it out. However, if you're going to shoot and incorporate a bright light into the scenario, your meter is going to be thrown off. And what we need to do is we need to kind of meter not the light itself, because the light, no matter what you do, it's going to be blown out, okay? But look, oftentimes the light is reflecting onto a sidewalk or a street below, and oftentimes those areas are gray. So we can meter off. It's more important for us to have detail at the bottom, right, on the street itself. So meter for what's the light is shining onto, whether it be a house or a sidewalk or a street. Look to that as sort of the key to your exposure. And you can look at that street light, that looks a little kind of, just a little bit bulby. But by using our aperture, when we make our aperture smaller, if we go from like f5.6, which I believe this one was shot at, now if we could go to f16, we're going to turn that, any sort of direct lights, like street lamps or like lights on bridges, okay, we'll turn them into little starbursts, okay? So, and that's a really a good thing to utilize, and that's one thing okay, now I'm going to think about my aperture a little bit more, because now f22 and f16, maybe this might be a little too much of a starburst effect. So usually f8 or f11 are going to give you a little bit of that pop, so it's not just a ball of light, but a little bit of just a little bit more feel to it. And again, here's another shot of talking about bridges. So here I am shooting at f11, so I'm getting a little bit blips in it. The farther away you get from the subject, the easier it is to shoot. So this is, cityscapes are a popular thing to shoot at night. This is 9/11 a couple years ago, and I was able to easily incorporate, the reflections of the water, the Brooklyn Bridge, the lights, and then the blue lights of it. But it's easy to meter there. The light, all these bright lights are a mile or two away, so they're not as, we're not looking for detail in them. They add to the noir, of the romantics of the scene. Or we can kind of zoom in a little bit closer and kind of look at it. And we got a little bit of the moving cars over here, and then we have the Empire State Building. So here I went out to Corona Park, and this now here again talking about how do we incorporate these high, right now this is a well-lit, bright area, and it's about 8 to 10 stops brighter than the sky is. When I got to the scene, I was like, oh, I missed it. I should have been here at twilight, and that way it would have been only about 2 or 3 stops of light difference between it, and it would have been perfect to just capture in one shot. Now I could have, again, tried to HDR this or just try to take more and more, but I was like, you know what? I'm gonna move on. I metered sort of for this. I didn't meter for the direct lights, but I metered for the foreground, which is being lit by the light, and took it. I was like, okay, I just know to kind of, if I want to go shoot this, I really should go back and shoot this in that twilight hour. And I kind of just said, let me look for something with a simpler lighting scenario. There's plenty of subject matter around Corona Park, so I went kind of around to these statues and around here, and these are being lit up by the moon and some street lamps as well. And here I got, some, I think an easier way and a more productive night out of it instead of spending, spending about an hour, bracketing and merging things together on this one. Okay, long exposure noise reduction, which kind of gets back to our reciprocity talk a little bit here. So digital cameras don't suffer from reciprocity failure. That's something that film suffers from, and we're about to talk. However, what they have, and what's usually a default on your camera, is they have what's called long exposure noise reduction. And it's usually in your menus, and it's usually set for on. And what it does, basically, is every time you take a picture, usually maybe over a second, or and on, what it'll do is it'll take, it's called a dark frame subtraction, okay? And if you take an exposure for 10 seconds, what it's gonna do is then for another 10 seconds, it's gonna do in-camera Photoshop. It's basically taking a dark frame, or taking a picture of a black slide and sandwiching on it and sort of getting rid of any, and by sandwiching that on it, it's sort of getting rid of any sort of noise that's in the image, okay? Now, I typically don't like to use long exposure noise reduction because it's very limiting. It'll soften the picture a little bit because we're stacking this dark slide onto it. And plus, hey, it brings down my productivity. If I'm kind of averaging 4 or 6 minute exposures, that means I have to wait another 4 or 6 minutes. And when you wait, often most cameras, that's it. You can't do anything, can't take another picture with it. So you're just kind of sitting around waiting for it to cook, okay? So there are some cameras, I know the Canon 5D Mark II, it has a buffer in it that it will do that in the background. It will allow you to keep shooting, but if you shoot 2 or 3 of these, the buffer will fill up and then you gotta wait. So hopefully that's something more cameras are getting better battery life because of the video capabilities, and this is something that, night photographers were, protesting about better battery life and everything like that. They weren't hearing us. We're definitely part of the 99%. But the video is definitely dominating it more, and they're making better battery life, and hopefully this will come into play and help us as well. But again, so usually it's called LENR, long exposure noise reduction. Now most modern cameras, you actually don't need, they're very good with noise for these longer exposures for up to about 6 minutes, which is very serviceable for most of our shots. Now, a big part of how, what I advise people to do is go home and test their individual camera. A big factor on how lengthy you can make your exposures without suffering from in-camera noise, the LENR, long exposure noise, is the temperature outside. The hotter it gets, the hotter the sensor gets. And the hotter the sensor gets, the noisier it gets, Okay, so again, northeast, wintertime, good time for night photography. Not a good time for your hands, but the camera, I was shooting with some friends and we were in the desert and it was cold at night, no problem. Then we went back in the summer and it was 80 degrees at night. Forget about it. We were averaging maybe 2 minutes exposure. So it can be drastic. You know, when you take a picture, zoom in, you know, go home and just take a picture of your white wall and do one at 1 minute, do it at 2 minutes, do it at 4 minutes, do it at 6 minutes, 8 minutes, you know, and kind of see, and then blow it up 100% on your screen and see where you start to see noise. When these red flecks start coming in. Okay, all right, that means I can now, you know, my camera is kind of geared towards about 6 minutes or 4 minutes. Okay, again, so temperature, when temperature starts to get above like 65 degrees, 68 degrees, that's when you have to start paying attention and maybe lessening those longer exposures. Now with film, film suffers from what's called reciprocity failure, relationship failure. And it's usually, typically after a second, okay? Now, most film has a chart, and I advise if you go to Kodak or Fuji or Ilford's website, you can either Google reciprocity failure for your film, and a chart will come up, and it'll say, you know, a lot of times it'll give you a curve, and it'll say after 1 second, you add a half a stop more than you normally would. After 10 seconds, add, you know, a full stop. You know, after 20 seconds, add, you know, 30 stops. And it's funny, like I said, the two films that I really like, Fuji Acros, doesn't suffer from reciprocity failure until 2 minutes. It's really, really good. Kodak Tri-X, a 400 speed film, a more sensitive film, a more supposedly more pliable film, suffers at 1 second. Okay? Astia, Fuji Astia, the slide film, which usually slide films, you got to really nail them, you know. But that film, beautiful film, and it doesn't suffer reciprocity failure for 3 minutes. So that means, so if I meter and I figure out that it's about a 10-minute exposure, okay? Let's say my reciprocity failure chart for Astia means I need to add maybe 2 more stops of light to it. So I go from 10 minutes to 20 minutes to 40 minutes. And that's a 100 speed film, so now that's my reciprocity. I've added the 2 stops, I have my chart, or I download it. A lot of times what I've done is I've kind of broken down the chart and I've taped it to my meter, and I bring it with me, or a lot of times I know now. Kodak Tri-X, it's about 8 stops. So now you're looking at about a 3-hour exposure, which you want that, you know? I mean, we'll definitely see some Star Trail examples for that, so. All right. So again, so this is a, let's see, what was this, this is about like a 6-minute exposure at night back at the junkyard. And this is sort of a screenshot from Lightroom. Now this is sort of the histogram I look for at night. That's a good histogram. It's kind of moundy. It doesn't get all the way to the highlight side, but the highlights are right over here. Those street lamps in the distance, okay? That's the street, that's it. But now, again, looking at this on the back of the screen, or looking at it even now, you're like, well, that doesn't look like night. That's sort of it. When we shoot these longer exposures, you're going to suffer a little bit for that day for night sort of look. It's going to look like the day because we got a lot, but we have a lot more information. So what I want to do is, this is what I want to kind of shoot for, this histogram, this look, and then in post-production, I just underexpose it by a half a stop. I'm using more information and bringing it down instead of using less information and bringing it up. If I use less information and bring it up, I'm actually, bringing more grain and degrading image quality. Whereas if I have more information and compress it a little bit, it's still the optimal quality. And a lot of times, this is just a half a stop or a stop that I need to do. And now it has that moody night feel. Okay? Shooting the moon. So it's a hard thing to do, and it's actually not a typical night exposure that I've talked about tonight. The moon is reflecting the sun's light, okay? And it is, if we think about it, it is actually very quick exposure. An average exposure to capture the moon like this is about 250th of a second, 500th of a second at f11. And then you need to have pretty much a lens that can get between, 400 millimeter. Because you really want to fill, for the most part, if you want to get that crater shot of the moon, you want to kind of fill that shot. I advise getting it as soon as the moon is rising. It looks bigger, and what David Hasworth did, adding the forest in there as well to kind of even give it perspective, give it size.
What ASA?
It wasn't listed on here, but it was probably a 100, 200 ASA. Again, it's very, very bright. The moon is bright. How I usually work with the moon is like this. Again, if we shoot the moon, we do have to watch out for some flare. There's a little bit of flare right there. And what I'll tell you is basically if you're going to incorporate the moon into the shot, the maximum exposure, and I already mentioned this with the clouds, is probably going to be about 4 minutes. Remember, the Earth is rotating, we're moving, even though we don't feel it, the camera's capturing it. And for most times, we want to keep that moon round. Longer than 4 minutes, it's going to start to stretch and become oblong. At night, star trails are interesting, but moon trails, not so much. So, and I want to kind of talk a little bit about how I shot this one. I used a couple different flashlights in here. The moon I wanted to incorporate the moon for dramatic effect, and I wanted to make it seem like the moon is lighting up that car. It's not. It's actually me walking into the shot. I had the driver's seat open. I took my flashlight. I bent down low like this, and I tested it before I took every time you do light painting, test it before. And I shot down low just for a second to create that dramatic shadow of the steering wheel on the very reflective mirror, or a very, very reflective window. So that was how I got that. Then I took those little key lights we use. That's how I lit up these little lamps right here, and I just stood in front of it like this to light it up. If I would have lit it up like this, you would have seen it. Okay? But if by blocking it and using the reflection, the very reflective headlamps, I was able to get that. Yep.
You only did that for a quick second and then out?
Not just on and off. Yep. Because glass is very reflective, right? I didn't want to burn it out, right? You have a question here?
Yeah, when you mentioned 4 minutes max,
Yep.
to keep the moon sharp, what focal length are you talking about? Does this going to affect
It does affect it. Okay, so the question is, what focal length are you going to use for the length of your exposures that it doesn't become too oblong? The more telephoto you get, the less time you get, because the more cropped in and the more movement you're going to see on it. So this was shot with a 14 millimeter. So I would say from 14 to 24, you got about 4 minutes before it sort of gets oblong. And then from probably 35 to 75, you probably got about 2 minutes. Okay? The full moon advantage. This is sort of my favorite type of photography. This was a shoot that I went on in San Francisco. This is the Sutro Baths, and it was during a full moon, and this was shot with film. And it was at this point when I was like, you know what? I went with some friends who are doing this almost every month, and I'm like, you know what? I need to dedicate myself to shooting every full moon. Again, this is sort of when you decide upon a project, when you decide upon doing something, make sure you dedicate something and go in and using the full moon to sort of, in a rural area, that's the only light there is. It's a really beautiful, beautiful look to it. There's no other light here. And it looks like sort of a surreal moonscape, right? So a good starting point for full moon, and this is for film, with that this was shot with the Acros, is it kind of easy. It's f8 for 8 minutes at ISO 100. It's kind of a good starting point.
That's with the
That's with the reciprocity figured in for that film, for Acros.
You metered that with your camera or separately?
I metered that with my camera, yeah. And for digital, it's probably going to be a good starting point. Is probably going to be about that, for 100 ISO, probably around like 4 to 6 minutes, full moon, at f8. It's a good starting point. But again, we'll do that test shot and kind of figure it out and hone it from there. Star trails. Let's get to this. Is a very sort of exciting part and can cause a lot, it tries to create a totally different scene than what you see with your eyes. So again, like I said, looking back at the Van Gogh image, I really am kind of turning towards the more of a celestial look. And this is Pyramid Lake. This is actually not too far from, for those of you who had an iPad 1, the screensaver for the iPad 1, night shot. 8x10, about 20 minutes long. Look at the star trails on it. Okay, so I kind of went to this same sort of area. I was like, oh, that's so cool. Now, night photography is really going to blow up now because everyone's got it as a screensaver. So I went to that area, and this is about a 4-minute exposure. But on this one, I am facing north because then I went over here, and this is north over here. Okay, so this is about a 30-minute exposure right here. And as we can see, the north, as the Earth rotates, the North Star remains constant. So that's going to always be just the blip. And then as we move away to the east and the west, the curves of the star trails are going to be shorter and curvier. And when they go farther away, working their way towards the south, they're going to become longer and less curvy. Okay, so that's sort of going back to the first slide. I was pointing south because that's where I could get the straightest lines. Okay, question in the back of the room? This is Pyramid, the question is where is this located? And this is Pyramid Lake in Nevada. It's near Reno. Okay.
You have to be definitely in a rural area to get any star trails. You can't get star trails in the city.
It's difficult. It's difficult. I mean, you have to find an area where the sky is not, go on, if you can get a clear night. There's no moon this night.
Right.
Okay, and the moon will play a part of it. If the moon was over here, that's going to be washing away the star trails over here. So yeah, the more rural you go, the easier it's going to get. I have gotten some star trails, around the city, but you kind of have to get to an area where there's not a lot of light in the sky and definitely no clouds and stuff like that. Yeah? This is Bannerman Island. This is about 2 hours north of here, right in the middle of the Hudson River. I offer workshops here a couple times a year. It's a sleepover workshop. Really cool. Limited to about 6 people. So I'm done with this season this year. We had 2 successful ones this year. We're going to probably go with 4 next year. But this is shot with film, and that's about an hour and a half exposure. Again, shooting right to the north. North Star, right there. This is a cool shot I like to talk about by Dan Heller. And he didn't have the information on here, but I'm probably thinking this is anywhere from a 2 to 4 hour exposure. What's that?
Figure out how long it is by having the distance on the clock face.
Right.
So that's
Yeah. So what's nice about this one, I like to show this one because there's a lot of stuff going on over here. Can anyone guess besides the tents, there's some squiggly lines and stuff like that. Anyone guess what's going on over there?
Hikers?
It's flashlights of people walking to the outhouse right over there. Okay, so I like to talk about this one because again, where I kind of told you about when we operate and we bring light into the scene, you have to be very aware. If I walk, if the camera's taking a picture of me right here and I walk in with a flashlight, guess what? That light is going to be permanent. All light is permanent. Okay, so we have to be careful. If I want to light up this wall over here, it's better for me to get away from the scene and light it from this way instead of going like this. Okay?
I heard some software that does stacking.
Yep. Yeah. So there's more. There's definitely quite a little bit of stacking software that's out here that's more available now. I think Robert Brown, who's an Adobe evangelist, just came out with a stacking software. What's important now, right? For me, star trails, are very easy. With film, the more dramatic these longer star trails really happen when we can get to at least a half an hour to an hour and a half and beyond. That's where we're going to get these really dramatic ones. But guess what? With digital, that's very hard to achieve because we already kind of discussed that we have that long exposure noise reduction. So after 6 minutes, we're going to have to, so if we do an hour exposure, we're going to have to do an hour of long exposure noise reduction, and our battery's probably dead after that. So what do we do with that? So recently, what people have been doing has been what's called something called stacking. And basically, if you take multiple exposures, it's like HDR, but if you take multiple exposures, but the key is this. You have to take, so you say, all right, I'm going to do 10 4-minute exposures. Because that will equal 40 minutes exposure by stacking all the highlights onto the image. The key is you cannot have more than a second gap in between those exposures. If you have more than a second gap, you're going to have breaks in those star trails, and that won't look good. So there are, the Nikon remote does not do it. The Canon remote does, and I'm pretty sure that the Pure Stone and Velo remotes are able to, you're able to set that timer. That's where that more expensive timer comes into play, where you can kind of put it for an interval setting of, I'm going to do 10 shots in a row with a 1-second gap for 4 minutes long. That's how you can do that. Okay? This was my first, or one of my first light painting experiences, and this was actually with David Brommer. I was vacationing with him in Italy, and the first day I landed, I was totally, out of it because it was like just a red-eye flight, and he brings me he said, Gabe, we gotta shoot here. He brings me to this location. It's just sort of this, I remember we drove up this road that was barely big enough for the car to fit on. This is not on the, this is not on the map, I think it was San Donatello's church, I believe it was called. And it's just like, we're going by, animals and stuff like that. And we get up there and I'm like, whoa, this is cool. We got to shoot here at night. And of course, we didn't get to it till the last night that we're there. I'm like, David, we got to go there. We got to shoot. He's like, all right, let's do this. And we were staying at his mother-in-law's house. Doesn't know a lot of English, but she said, watch out for the wildcats. And I was just like, wildcat? What do you mean wildcats? And she's like, there's wildcats at night. And I'm like, all right, we're in Tuscany. We're near Umbria. There's no Umber Hulks. There's no, what was it, saber-tooth tiger? What do you, I know there's strange things happen, but we were like joking about it the whole drive up there. But I mean, it was one of these drives where it's like driving, it's all dirt, 5 miles an hour, looking for wildcats. We finally get there, and we set up our shots, and I'm shooting, this is a shot with film, and I'm shooting this, and I'm like, I figured out that this was about a 15-minute exposure, and so I'm like, I got everything set up, but the moon hadn't risen. The moon is rising behind it, and as we setting we set the exposure, it's cooking, and I'm like, luckily I shot this with a Mamiya 7, which is a rangefinder, and it's one of the the rangefinders you can continue to look through because you're just looking through a viewfinder. I'm like, you know what? I'm looking at this scene. I'm like, you know what? That moon is going to come up, and I'm going to get just like this blob of a line, just probably like right there. So I'm like, I got to cut my exposure short. And so I said, okay, let me cut my exposure short. David, put a black card over your camera so you're not getting this in. I said, I'm going to start light painting, filling in the shadows of the wall here. So I just stood by my camera and kind of lit it up for about 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and this is what I got. And I was quite happy with it. And I'm going to show an example a little bit later. What I should have done is I should have went at more of a 45-degree angle, more of kind of cutting out the side, and all lighting. The worst lighting is directly on, right? If we get to the side and we're lighting, now we're adding depth to the scene. So that's where I should have done in this shot, but it's something you learn with experience. Here's a couple. So again, this is the Pearsonville workshop with Troy and Joe. Again, they have access to junkyards in the Mojave Desert in California, and getting a chance to work with Troy. I don't typically do this sort of, light painting, but I was like, you know what? Troy's here. I want to learn from him. That's why we're here. So, and even though I want to go out of my box and learn from him and see how it is to kind of just experiment with adding a lot of color and a lot of different colors to it. So this was used with a flash. This was very, I don't know what kind of car this or vehicle this is, you know, chains and everything. But this was used with to light this one up, I used a flash and a flashlight. When we gel a flash, especially with a deep gel like red, we're taking away 2 or 3 stops of light, so we need more power. So I was popping a flash in here about 6 or 7 times to light this up. The surface in here was brown, so dark as well. Tires, anything like I said, anything black at night, is just really, it swallows up the light. So what I did then was I kind of flashlights, you can finesse the light a little bit more. So what I did is I used a flash here and I kind of lit up that tire over there very subtly, but for about 2 minutes I was lighting that up because that darkness was really swallowing it up. This is an 18-wheeler that Troy and I decided to shoot together, to light paint together. And I said, let's candy stripe it. Let's go just kind of crazy with it. And he's like, all right, cool. So, and with this one, I learned a very cool, a very good technique. And so I had a flashlight, a high-power flashlight with a red gel and a green gel that I could easily swap between. So I handled the candy striping, and Troy used just a standard flashlight and kind of opened up the shadow and worked on the tires in here. It's about a 4-minute exposure, so we didn't have a ton of time. So we figured out that, you know, we kind of set our compositions, and we did a practice run of it, and I was about 30 feet away. And the first shot I did was I turned on the flash and then went down. Turned on, you know, and then I did every other one red, gelled it, and did the other 2 green. That first shot had a hot spot at almost every, like if I started right here, it'd be a hot spot because it would be that second of turning on the camera instead of it being a smooth stroke all the way through. So Troy was like, hey, figure out the distance and start the light, turn it on up in the sky. You're not going to light up the sky, and then just go down and click off. So I did that, and that's what created this one. So I turned it on, down, click off. Turned it on, down, and click off. Turn on to the sky, down, click off, and switch to the red. And that's what we got. So again, this is a good example, like I just said, about creating depth with a flash or a flashlight. And with this one, this is a fire truck from the 1930s. And again, with this one, instead of doing the light straight on, I went more of an angle and created, we can see this little more depth to it over here. You know, we can really pick up the detail, the sort of the paint peeling and stuff like that off of it. And then this is, I also teach up at the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. So lead some workshops up there. It's a fun place to be, except when you're left alone. Yeah. Which I was for this shot. The ground started getting squishier, and I was like, oh, zombies? But no, it's cool. It's a really good, they run a great program up there. And how do we light up these tombstones? And a great way when there's that sort of inscription and that detail on the tombstones, especially by going at that 45-degree angle, we can really pull out that inscription on there. So this one, again, I lit with this is not one with a flash you're going to light because I need to finesse it. I need to get a tight beam in there and kind of wash over it. A flash would have kind of lit up everything, and this would have probably lit up over here. So I kind of went along the side and lit up these 2 rows, just one pass along. It was about I think a 40 lumens flashlight that pulled it out. But I lit it on both sides, so each one has got a nice little side light on it too.
Is that the one in the left of that?
Let's see. That is. And light writing. One of the first light writings that come out onto the scene was the images by Picasso. He did some amazing, he kind of like, it was an amazing sort of thing to see his images just for a fraction of a second captured forever on light. So this is, he definitely inspired, early on a generation of it that kind of sat dormant for a long time. But his images are amazing, his bulls and all the other things he made. The key with light writing, especially if you're going to write words, is that you need to make sure that the letters need to be written backwards. Okay, so U's are easy, V's are easy, T's are easy, but E's are really tricky. So And then again, depending upon how much you're in it, like sometimes you can see these people, depends upon the lumens of the flashlight. A lot of times I like to use a lower power lumens. Again, those mag lights really are good for that. And we could, you know,
With the rear shutter sink,
what's that?
is that Picasso with the rear shutter sink? Is that Picasso?
Picasso.
Oh, that was just well, you know, he probably popped a little flash in there as well. I'm not quite, don't have the details on that one, but to freeze him, he probably popped a flash right at the end. Yep. So rear curtain sink. And this is another cool one right here. Again, drawing figures. Again, when you're drawing and you're purposely drawing things, just remember to turn on and off, because again, the beam is constant. So if you don't want to overlap, turn it off and start again. And
Question on the Picasso. So,
Yeah.
the long exposure while he's doing the light painting,
right.
and then how are you freezing him at the end?
At the end with a flash. The flash is not going to blow away the light that's already been drawn on there.
Is he static at that point?
Yeah, you know, the flash is only for a fraction of a
So he
second.
does his thing, then he holds a pose flash.
Exactly. This is all in the dark, you know, and he draws it, and then he's like, poof, a flash at the end to freeze him permanently on there. And I have an example of one in a few minutes as well. The future, this was written with iPads. Okay, so any light object can be used. LEDs, you know, anything that can light up, we can use it to draw or do something creative, given it. This is a really cool group. This is Sensel and Jens, and they incorporate these sort of light shapes into dramatic landscapes. Adding star trails to it as well. So you know, attaching lights to, you know, twirlers and all sorts of, like, not quite sure how they did this one. Probably, you know, one light on, you know, how we made those giant bubbles. So probably that was put LED lights and just kind of walk like this around, something like that. And I just shot this with some students last week on the High Line. And again, this is the same sort of example going back to Picasso. I had this girl wrote, first of all, actually I shot this at the beginning, the group shot of them, and you can see she's here and she's there. Okay, so I shot at the beginning, froze them, and then I did let them do their writing, and then I popped a flash on her at the end so I can get her twice in it. This was
They
the
actually just manually pop the flash twice off.
yeah. That's I'm just mainly, you know, again, because we want to create a little bit more depth to it instead of getting it on directly on. This is the Valley of Fire in Las Vegas, and it's funny. There's a fireworks store right before you enter there, and then like 100 feet away it says no fireworks. I'm like, well, why do you let them? Why do you have that? Why do you let them do that? So of course we got fireworks, and of course we played with it. But again, looking at, so this one, he's twirling these fireworks there. I'm using a flash red gel to light up the red rocks to let them get more red. And I made a mistake this time because boom, there's my flash right there. So again, I should have, you know, been popping it, you know, by guarding it. It kind of works into it, you know. If I probably didn't tell you, you wouldn't have noticed it, but it's a little bit different color. It's that gel light. And it's just trying out different things. This is him just doing it sporadically. I kind of like the one above a little bit more. You can see him a little bit more, but the other one's a little bit more chaotic, so it's all what you're into. Creating ghosts. This is another fun thing you can do, given time. Okay? This is an image I took right when I moved to New York, and this is on the Brooklyn Bridge. This was shot with film, and this is actually it's sort of a triple. She's in it 3 times. She's in it all the way back here, one right there, and then the front one right there. And this one was an early experiment on me creating ghosts, especially with flash. So how I did this one, set it up, we're long exposure, and told her stand there, and I kind of stood behind here, popped her flash. She had a black coat on, so that was my first mistake, really. So white reflective face, black coat. I should have popped her quite a few more times, or get a different color that's slightly more reflective. You know, maybe like a khaki or a green, but having a dark black coat is really difficult to light. So So I shot her once there. I had her move 6 feet. Shot her again. That's why I started to get the side light of her because I'm behind there. And then at the end, I said, okay, stop there. And I sort of lit her at about a 30-degree angle from there. It works. It worked to a certain degree, floating head-ish, but I still like it. I still like it. But if I were to go back and do it again, that's sort of what I would do. And I actually tried to go back and do it again, and for some reason, there are more vibrations than ever on the Brooklyn Bridge. You can't get away with more than a minute and a half exposure, Maybe there wasn't as many cars going down that night or whatever, but yep.
So you're saying that you flash the light and it'll stay.
Yep.
How come you don't see the beam of light from your light bulb or flashlight on, going across?
The beam of light would need to hit something reflective in order for it to be there permanently, like the snow. Okay? So why do you don't see the beam of light until it hits something reflective like her face? Okay? This was the first ghost shot I actually did. And this is me, where Ben-Hur, went around, Circus Maximus in Rome? So this is me on a little night walk in Rome. And this is a perfect ghost. And this one I did without any light. This was a 6-minute exposure that I was sitting there for 3 minutes. And I just counted in my head to 3 minutes. So if you think about it, think of mass. If you're there for half the exposure, half of you is going to show up, right? You'll be able to see through you. Well, hopefully it's the right half. But and I put myself in the proper background. I had kind of darker clothes, khaki and green clothes on a white step background. So be aware of your backgrounds. If it's black on black, you're not going to see that. If it's white on white, you're not going to see that.
Do ghosts have shadows?
Ghosts do. Look at that. Ghosts have shadows. Yeah, we were wondering that. Casper, I didn't see it so much, but yes.
It's not a vampire.
Yeah, exactly. This is a 6-minute exposure.
6 minutes, you're in there for 3.
I'm in there for half of the time.
See you moving in and out.
You don't see me walking out, correct? Because I'm only at that other one. You don't see me walking out because I need to be there for at least a third of the exposure, more like half, to have that proper mass to be in there. I can easily, if I'm taking a picture and I walk in and out, you're not going to see me. Unless the only time you see me if it's a fraction of a second, if it's only a 3-second exposure and you see me walk through, then you'll see a ghost of me walk through. But the longer the exposure, you need to be there for at least a third at the same spot. I have this shot of sort of like this cobblestone in the Trastevere area in Rome, and you see a couple feet, ghost feet. And that was about at like an 8-minute exposure. And those people must have been standing there at that same spot for at least 3 minutes. Otherwise, but we don't see the rest of their bodies because the background matches sort of the clothes they were wearing. Yep.
Same with
Yep.
Same with the full moon shot of the car at night where you light.
Exactly. I can walk right into that. Now again, if I have that light on, that'll be permanent. But I could easily walk in and out of a longer exposure and not worry about being in it. Okay? Yes?
Going back to that, when the Brooklyn Bridge ghost shot,
Yep.
you said you shot from behind the wall?
Yep.
So you just were there and then you walked back out?
Correct.
And shot your third one?
Yep.
Can you track, what did she do? What was her track during the exposure?
Well, I just made her, going back to the Brooklyn Bridge shot, where was she? I said, I kind of marked the spots where I wanted her to stand.
And she just walked?
She would walk to them. You know what, let's look at that picture again a little bit closely. Probably a little bit of this, see that little trail?
Yeah.
Could be a little bit of her blonde hair being there because she stood there a little. I think I might have had her.
It's hard to see all 3 images of her.
It is, it totally is. If I were to do this one now,
Yeah.
what I would have done, because this has to go with sort of the distance away, I would have popped, this one was kind of fine if she had the proper coat, clothing. I think that's exposed properly. And this one, I probably would have gone to like 2 or 3 pops of the flash. And this, what's that?
That's where you were behind the wall.
Yeah, that's where I was behind the wall. And then this one, I would have probably popped it about 6 or 8 times
And
because
you were all the way down there popping the
I was just behind right here, so it's only 6 feet away. I was probably 6 or 8 feet away from her, but in all, I'm probably about maybe 20 feet away from her right here, 15 feet away. So again, it's sort of going back to lighting and distance.
Yeah.
We need more light the farther away we are from that subject matter. So if I were to go back and do this one successfully, 6 to 8 pops of a flash right there. But here's the tricky point, though I think it would have worked here, she can't move, right? I gotta pop those quick Because if she moves like, or maybe I want her to move. If I can pop her like this, I can pop her like that. I can pop you twice shaking hands with yourself.
So, approximately how long was that exposure?
This one was about like 6 minutes, 8 minutes.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
So I did have some time, but this actually takes up quite a bit of time.
Full power flash?
I was doing full power flash. Yeah. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, and there's also, so when I went back to this, so this is actually when I went back to that and I was trying to shoot it again, but I was using me and I was like, wow, I can't get away with anything on the Brooklyn Bridge for over a minute and a half. So I'm like, we visit those same spots often. And we have to challenge ourselves to interpret it in a new way. Look for something new. Look for a new idea. Look for something. So this is the shot I came away with, and I'm very happy with that. You know, I saw the traffic kind of moving in, and this is about a 30-second to a minute exposure. Getting those cars coming in, getting the 9/11 lights in the distance. This is in Portland, Oregon. That's the Steel Bridge, and I noticed this, and I was on an area of the bridge. When we have bridges, we got to look out for vibration, but I was on a cement area on the bridge. This was wooden over here, so the cement wasn't vibrating. So there was cars coming, but even cooler, there was like, trolleys coming by. So they had lights even taller. That's why I get, that's where I'm getting the yellows, and the reds are obviously the tail lights, but I'm getting these other colors and other levels of light. This image was an overcast night. It was, without this, that's kind of a boring shot. But with this, it's a very interesting shot. This was shot with a lens baby. So trying different lenses, again, things that work well during the day will often work well at night. And I like using the lens baby at night because it turns these direct lights, these are all street lights, it turns them into frisbees of light, which is really not, I wouldn't want to do that in Photoshop. That would be quite tedious. A popular thing to shoot at night, of course, is fireworks. I don't do a lot of fireworks shots. I have a couple examples of some images here, but I do have a couple good tips on shooting fireworks. Obviously, finding an ideal vantage point. Water is nice because you get the reflections, finding landmarks that you can kind of key it in with. If you are close to where they are firing the lights, be wary of downward smoke, or stray light from, and be also aware of, again, the flare from street lamps, okay? But here's the key, really. Set your ISO, there's no test shots on this one. Basically, set your ISO to your optimal ISO, 100 or 200. Set your focus to infinity, because it's definitely, it better be 30 feet away. And then shoot at a nice, aperture to get some depth, f8 or f11. And this is where that black card, again, is going to come into play. Because what you're going to do is you're going to set it for like 30 seconds or a minute, a minute and a half maybe. And basically, what's interesting about a firework is the blast, the burst. Not the tail of the mushroom, not the. That's not interesting. So. What we can do with this is we can kind of start the exposure, have that black card over the lens, and then each time there's an explosion, we remove the black card, put it back in. So really, even though it might be a minute exposure, you're really only exposing for maybe 4 seconds, 3 seconds, and you're capturing and stacking bursts like that one up top. There's some playing with it. You got to make sure you can be over. There's sort of a fine line between it. Shooting raw, put that noise reduction off as well. But again, shooting remotely with that black card and lifting it during the bursts is the best way to go. Pitfalls at night. Again, like I kind of discussed the tripods. A good tripod starts about $100. This image of the Acropolis was shot with a $30 just plastic tripod that I think is most of our first tripods. So investing in a sturdier tripod, it's going to be rock solid. Luckily I was able to go back here, but if you're at these locations and you don't have something solid, you're not going to come away with a good tripod. Clouds, we kind of discussed this already. Clouds start to smear at 4 minutes. This is in Red Hook, white on white here. So I kind of was like, and this was with film, so I didn't have any feedback, but I was looking through the viewfinder. I'm like, I want to adjust this just slightly so I'm getting the more of the contrast of the white on the dark background. So I thought, that the second image made it a little bit more interesting. Boats on the horizon. So we saw the previous shot of this image, but again, any sort of light in the scene is going to be permanent. So airplanes and boats can be a little tricky. A lot of times you want to avoid those. Back to Corona Park, which is, if you're not familiar, it's right near LaGuardia Airport. And I can tell you until about 11 o'clock at night, they fire off a plane every 3 minutes. So right there, now I'm limited to a 3-minute exposure, and because we can see there's the plane right up at the top going through that. Unless, again, utilizing that black card, if you hold it over the lens for the length of that airplane, it doesn't show up. Okay? So, you have to be careful with that lens. You don't want to, it's a fine line of kind of just hovering over it and not obviously bumping it. You don't want to bump your tripod or bump your lens at night. And just, strange things happen at night. I have no idea what this is. This is going back to the Sutro baths, but I don't know any plane that shoots like that, and maybe it's ET or a satellite coming back home. I'm not quite sure, but capture it, and you never know what'll happen, as long as they don't come knocking on your door, right? So I'm teaching, my next workshop is in March. And I'm teaching it with a great photographer, great landscape photographer, Tim Cooper, who spoke here a couple times. And it's through the Rocky Mountain School of Photography. And we're doing a 1-week workshop in Vegas. It's Dusk to Dawn. And we're basically spending about 3 nights in Vegas shooting the urban city lights. And then we're going to Zion National Park and and we'll be there for the full moon and be able to get a really amazing dramatic nightscape. So. There's information on Rocky, if you just Google, if there's information on Rocky Mountain School of Photography or rmsp.com. If you Google Vegas to Zion, that's the only workshop I know named like that. It is a week long, and you're gonna, you fully immerse yourself, 6 nights of shooting, and we'll review, critique, give you hands-on tips and tricks. So definitely taking advantage of that. I do, like I said, excuse me, if you don't want to go out west, I do teach things more local at Sleepy Hollow, and at the Bannerman Castle is a really cool one too. Yeah. Finally, here is my resource page. So I'll leave this up. If anyone doesn't write it down as well, feel free to email me via, you can contact me through ruinism.com, and I can send you this. But basically, here's a couple books. Lance Kiemig just came out with basically the book on night photography. I believe we sell it here. And basically it's called Night Photography, Finding Your Way in the Dark. Jill Waterman, a year or 2 before that, had the book on night photography. And it's a really cool book too. They definitely complement each other. Jill's is a little bit more film-based, and she actually has different photographers talking in different chapters about their techniques. But hers is called Low Light Photography, Night and Low Light Photography. We also sell that here. The Nocturnes, I told you that's a wonderful website, a wonderful resource website online that has online gallery shows you can take part in, as well as lots of night information. Lost in America is Troy's website, which he just revamped and now incorporates a blog and many more galleries. Joe Reifer, good friend of mine, and teaches the workshops with Troy. His blog, which is basically his name, Joe Reifer, /words. His blog is one of the best out there that I think for sort of night photography education, and he really breaks down pictures and shows how he got there. Does a lot of stacking, talks a lot about stacking and other techniques. This long one is actually a resource in the Nocturnes, and it's basically a calculator that'll figure out a good starting point exposure, especially for film at night. Sort of, so what you do is you put in the calculator, say, okay, it's a three nights past a full moon. I'm shooting with this film at this aperture, and it'll give you kind of a good starting point. Okay. By Googling, there's tons of light writing movies out on YouTube, Vimeo, etc. Like I said, taking workshops, will definitely get you into it more. Also, if you Google Night of the Living Photographers, a friend of mine by the name of Andy Frazier interviewed about 5 or 6 night photographers about 8 years ago. It's still really valid today and a lot of good information there. So
What is that Lance?
Lance Keemig, K-E-M-I-G. Yep.
Which is the book, the one that you said is the standard right now?
This one, Lance Keemig's Night Photography, Finding Your Way in the Dark. That's the best one right now. Folks, that's it. I thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
For more information, please visit us online, give us a call, or stop by our New York City Superstore. You can also connect with us on the web.